So this is the last session of this long road we've been down, and I want to try and pull everything together. We live and learn forward, but we understand when we look back and we describe, recollect what we've been through. So in one sense, all the material I'm going to discuss is stuff we've seen before. On the other hand, I think the vantage point that we get on that material from the end of the story makes it look different. And so that's how I'd like to proceed. So I want to start off by talking about Rorty's, the development of his thought. Using the conceptual raw materials that we assembled in the second half of the course, what we learned about pragmatism after Rorty, but to use that to redescribe what he achieved. And I think one thing we can say is that looking back, we can see that Rorty is a distinctive kind of pragmatist. He's a meta-linguistic pragmatist. And by that, I mean, his principal recommendation is that we work in pragmatic meta-vocabularies rather than in representational semantic meta-vocabularies. The pragmatic meta-vocabularies are the ones that let us say what we're doing when we make claims and talk about things, where the representational semantic meta-vocabularies that the philosophical tradition employs will let us say what we're talking about and characterize what's represented. So if you remember, one of the, I think, helpful slogans for Rorty's view is that he recommends that we think in terms of coping, not in terms of copying. Copying being the mirror of nature, the representation, that we think in terms of coping instead of copying. And I'm suggesting that we're now in a position to see that the pragmatist is asking what function in your life is performed by doing what you're doing when you talk the way you talk, when you employ the vocabulary that you employ. How does that help you cope is in the slogan. What role in your lived life does speaking that just doing what you're doing when you use that vocabulary play, or in the life of your community? That's a question that's asked and answered in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, one that you use to talk about what you're doing when you say something. What Rorty called, this is another one of his phrases, the linguistic turn, was the move from thinking about minds to thinking about language. Ian Hacking describes this movement as a move from the heyday of ideas in Enlightenment philosophy to the heyday of sentences in the 20th century. What distinguishes us is to be understood in the first instance, not as a capacity for rational thought, but as a capacity for discursive practice. That's the recentering that is the linguistic turn. And Rorty's idea was that, well, sentience is due to our biology. Our sapience is due to our society. Here, sentience is awareness in the sense of being awake, what we share with dogs and cats. And sapience is being aware in the sense of thinking that things are thus and so, being in a state with a content that can be expressed in a declarative sentence. And the linguistic turn thinks what turns us from merely sentient biological organisms into sapient selves and subjects of knowledge is coming into language, coming to engage in discursive practices. Pragmatism after the linguistic turn then is pragmatism about linguistic practice. And its principal claim is, think about what you're doing when you engage in discursive practice, when you deploy a vocabulary. And the question Rorty asks is whether it is in fact the most important feature of discursive practice that it functions to represent how things are. That was the idea of Enlightenment philosophy of mind and epistemology from Descartes to Kant, when the lesson they taught is transposed into a linguistic key, when we address it after the linguistic turn. So though Rorty never puts it this way, I'm suggesting we think of his pragmatism as recommending that we do our philosophical work in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary that lets us talk about what we're doing when we deploy a vocabulary, rather than thinking about it in a representational semantic meta-vocabulary that lets us talk about what we're talking and thinking about. Now, the first of the two lessons that we learned from Hugh Price, I think, is the distinction between object naturalism and subject naturalism. Object naturalism, naturalism about the objects we're talking and thinking about, what we're representing as being thus and so. And subject naturalism is naturalism about the practices we engage in or the abilities we exercise when we're talking and thinking. And I suggested that we could bring Rorty and Price closer together by generalizing that important lesson of Price's about subject naturalism and object naturalism by dividing through by the naturalism in the crucial opposition between object naturalism and subject naturalism. And the idea of that was that we could use the distinction adapted from the early Sellers between semantic metavocabularies and pragmatic metavocabularies in order to express the fundamental idea of Price's distinction in a way that lets us remain methodologically agnostic about when and even whether we ought to impose the requirement that those metavocabularies, pragmatic or semantic, be restricted to naturalistic vocabularies. That's an important commitment of Price's. It's not evidently one that Rorty shares. I'll say something about that in a minute. So if we make those two moves, that is, take on board Price's distinction between subject naturalism and object naturalism, we can see Rorty's pragmatism and then dividing through by the naturalism, by recasting Price's distinction in terms of pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies. Then we can see Rorty's pragmatism in the way I started off describing it, as recommending that we work in pragmatic metavocabularies instead of representational semantic metavocabularies. And that's what I mean by meta-linguistic pragmatism. And I think Rorty confirms that thinking of what he's doing as a distinctively meta-linguistic version of pragmatism is the right way to think about it. When beginning already in Consequences of Pragmatism, but coming to full flower in Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, he adopts what I've called the vocabulary, because that vocabulary bears on its face that it's a meta-vocabulary. It's a vocabulary for thinking about vocabularies. The other big lesson that we learned from Price is a crucial clarification of the notion of a representational semantic meta-vocabulary. It's a clarification that we can look back and apply to Rorty's invocation of representationalism and say, Price is giving us the conceptual machinery to sharpen and clarify the notion of representationalism under the heading of representational semantic meta-vocabularies that was Rorty's foe, but without Rorty clearly making the distinctions that Price gives us the tools to make. And when the dust has settled, if we look at Price's contemporary view, he's distinguishing two broad senses of representational semantic meta-vocabulary. One of them is an anodyne, very general sense in which some representational semantic meta-vocabularies apply to the use of all declarative sentences, all sentences that can be used to make claims or assertions. These are the ones he calls I-representational idioms. And they apply just in virtue of what's essential to and characteristic of what distinguishes discursive practice as such from practices that, while vocal, aren't genuinely verbal, are not really Sprachspiel. I've suggested that we think of those in terms of inferential roles, inference and assertion. I'll talk about that some more in a minute. But the idea is that all of our discursive practice has a representational dimension. And that's the what Price talks about under the heading of I-representation. More specifically, the locutions of ordinary language, ordinary natural language, rather than the idiom of high philosophical theory, already lets us distinguish between what we're saying or thinking on the one hand and what we're talking or thinking about on the other hand, where that latter suggests that besides the content, what we're saying or thinking, besides that content that's expressed by the sentences we use, there also is this representational dimension that we're talking or thinking about something. I'm thinking of a number. The child smoothly says. And Price is urging us to acknowledge this representational dimension and not to put it in the target area of our resistance to representationalism. That insofar as Rorty says things that commit him to rejecting this platitudinous observation about ordinary language, that there is already in our ordinary ways of talking about talking, a distinction between what we say and what we're talking about, that there is in that sense a representational dimension. Insofar as Rorty's philosophical crusade leads him to say things that would contradict that platitude, we ought not to go along with it. We should look for a way to acknowledge that platitude while still seeing what's right about the critique that he wants to make. And Price teaches us to contrast this broad notion of I-representation, which is universally applicable wherever assertion is taking place. So to language thought of as the declarativist thinks of language, the criterion of demarcation of a semantic theory being wherever declarative sentences are in order, which is wherever assertions are being performed on the pragmatic side, then syntactically we'll see declarative sentences as what one utters with the default pragmatic significance of making a claim. And if we think about it semantically, there will be a notion of propositional content, the thus and so, when we say that things are thus and so, that's expressed by the declarative sentence. But apart from the notion of I representation and the vocabulary in the sense of an idiom that lets us make explicit that representational dimension of discursive practice generally, there's a narrower notion, what he distinguishes as e-representation, that applies only to some partial dependent vocabularies, paradigmatically to the vocabularies of natural sciences and perhaps to ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary as well, but that does not, Price agrees with Rorty, does not apply to declaratives as such. And from the point of view afforded by Price's distinction, Rorty's rejection of semantic representational metavocabularies in favor of pragmatic metavocabularies should be clarified to involve the rejection only of e-representational semantic metavocabularies, and to be a rejection of them only for declaratives generally. They're all very well in their place. The mistake that we can see Rorty diagnosing with the eyes that Price gives us to see it is what Sellers called descriptivism. The assumption that e-representational semantic metavocabularies provide a model for understanding the use of language in general, and that licenses an invidious attitude towards other uses. Or another way of putting the same mistake, the idea that e-representational semantic metavocabularies are going to let us understand assertion and so propositional content generally, that we can do that in terms of e-representational semantic metavocabularies. That's what the mistake is taking that narrower model of semantic representation and trying to use it to understand discursive practice in general. And the idea is that the legacy of Enlightenment philosophy of mind and epistemology that Rorty rightly sees as a confining straitjacket to our philosophical understanding of ourselves has to be cast off in order for us properly to understand ourselves as discursive beings. So I think that if we assimilate these two lessons that Price teaches, distinction between subject and object naturalism, and the distinction between two senses of representation that are articulated by two different kinds of representational semantic metavocabularies, if we take those lessons on board, we can think through, well, in particular, the stages that Rorty's thought developed through, redescribe it in a new metavocabulary, well, indeed, a meta-metavocabulary for thinking about the relations between the pragmatic metavocabularies that Rorty thinks we should start with and that Price agrees, and now these two different kinds of representational semantic metavocabulary. So what I want to do now is walk through the 6 phases in the development of Rorty's thought that we rehearsed in the first half of the course in a little bit more detail, using this conceptual apparatus that we've gained from reading Price. So before I do that, let me stop there and ask whether this, is this clear? Does this sound like an appropriate application of the conceptual apparatus Price has given us to understanding Rorty and pragmatism? Okay. Well, let me see if I can share. Now, this is the handout that you should all have access to. I want to really do three things. I doubt I'll get to say much on this fourth heading. Want to rehearse, recollect these phases of Rorty's development, then talk about how Price and I, as admirers of Rorty, as philosophical sort of followers of him, see the positive tasks that are left once one takes on board Rorty's critique as a negative thesis, and the pragmatism that he recommends as a positive thesis. So what concrete philosophical theoretical tasks does that leave us with? And Price and I are in a surprising amount of agreement about what those are, and each of us finds what the other one is doing helpful in pursuing those. And then the third thing I want to do is adjudicate the dispute between naturalistic and normative pragmatic metavocabularies. So I said it would help us in thinking about Rorty to generalize Price's distinction between subject and object naturalism by dividing through by the naturalism. But in the end, it's important to him that we use naturalistic metavocabularies in order to understand what we're doing when we're talking. And it's important to me that we use normative ones. And so in this third section, I want to say something about what's at stake there and how we can understand that dispute, and in particular about how we might reconcile those different insights. The idea for the fourth section, which I doubt we will get to, that's just a sort of lagniappe. Maybe I'll have a chance to say a few words about it, is to fill in the idea that I've called of Rorty's that I've called social pragmatism about norms, the idea that normative statuses are social statuses. And we'll see whether I get to say something about that. So on the handout, I've indicated the 6 stages in which I've presented the development of Rorty's thought, where I see significant developments happening from one to another. And I want to say something more about each of those using the conceptual apparatus that we've inherited from Price. Okay, now these first two we didn't talk about a whole lot because I didn't have you read the introduction to his first book he edited, The Linguistic Turn of 1967, or the second episode, his incorrigibility is the mark of the mental, his diagnosis of Descartes' innovation, kicking off Enlightenment epistemology and philosophy of mind, and then the eliminative materialism that is his constructive response to that. So mostly I talked about these, we didn't read them. I think with the wisdom of hindsight, we can see that The Linguistic Turn was an important book for Rorty. It was his coming to terms with what was distinctive about analytic philosophy, Anglophone philosophy in the 20th century. This was our version of putting language at the center of philosophical concerns. I say our version, the Anglophone analytic version, because the 20th century was the century of language on the continent every bit as much as it was for Anglophone philosophers. Heidegger, early, middle, and late, is a philosopher of language. That's I've argued that we should understand being in time as giving us a pragmatic meta-language for thinking about what we're doing when we engage in discursive practices. And one of the famous epitomizing slogans of the later Heidegger is that language is the house of being. Language is still front and center in his concern. But Rorty coins this phrase, the linguistic turn, for the shift in emphasis from thinking of mindedness as prior conceptually and ontogenetically to the use of language, the Lockean picture of us already having minds and coming to use language to communicate the already completely formed thoughts that our minds were capable of framing, to a picture that sees the achievement of mindedness as at least simultaneous with our entry into language, our coming to engage in discursive practices, and conceptually, by and large, seeking to explain mindedness in terms of the linguistic rather than the other way around. When Rorty then embraces pragmatism as a way forward, past the criticisms that he's making of Enlightenment epistemology and philosophy of mind, it's going to be a pragmatism explicitly and self-consciously after the linguistic turn, that is, that has made the linguistic turn. And I think we can see that it's a distinctively meta-linguistic form of pragmatism. As I say, I think the best characterization of Rorty's pragmatism throughout, well, anyway, the last four stages of the development of his thought is as recommending that we work philosophically in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary rather than in a representational semantic meta-vocabulary. And that's a distinctively meta-linguistic kind of pragmatism. It's because he wanted to adapt pragmatism to the linguistic turn, to bring it up to date, that he could see Quine and Sellers as pragmatists, pragmatists in the sense, this would have to be the way we put it, not the way he puts it, in the sense that they were reverting to pragmatic meta-vocabularies, asking what we're doing. How is it that we have to use expressions to be treating a claim as analytic, as true in virtue of the meaning of the words? How do we have to treat knowledge claims to be treating them as immediate expressions of the sensory given? It's what let him see the later Wittgenstein as a pragmatist. And here I think it's helpful for us to think of Price redescribing the later Wittgenstein as a subject naturalist, saying, don't ask what numbers are, these things you're representing with numerals. Ask how you learn to use numerals. Think about practices of counting. Rorty, who's admiring and adapting Dewey, Dewey acknowledged that it was coming into discursive practice that made us sapient creatures. But what he didn't have was the sophisticated philosophy of language that Rorty retails in The Linguistic Turn, the 50 years of Anglophone philosophy of language. That's what separates Dewey from Rorty. And just as a marker for a point I'll come back to later, Rorty's conceptual vocabulary for thinking about the linguistic turn was to say, look, this is one move that people hadn't been able to see clearly because they mostly saw the opposition between two different ways of making it. And that's ideal language philosophy and ordinary language philosophy. So the ideal language philosophy that takes its paradigm from formal calculi, logical calculi, and wants to reconstruct the meanings of natural language expressions in terms of axiomatic systems, translating it into PMEs, Principia Mathematica vocabulary, as Sellers says, on the one hand, and ordinary language philosophy, Austin being the avatar of it, which keeps artificial languages at arm's length, but sees in ordinary language, or at least what these incredibly linguistically sophisticated Oxbridge professors spoke as ordinary language, claiming that all the conceptual distinctions we needed to do philosophy were already present in ordinary language. The distinction between a justification and an excuse, for instance, if we just pay enough attention. And Rorty saw that there was a commonality to this, saw this as an intramural disagreement between them. But now Rorty edited that book in '66. It came out in '67. He's 35 years old, and sort of here's his take on the recent tradition. But I think that it was the next phase, really work that culminated in publications in 1970. The incorrigibility is the mark of the mental and the eliminative materialism that really set the path for the rest of Rorty's life. So he's not quite 40 when he's doing this. This is the story that I tell in the brief piece called An Arc of Thought. Here, Rorty diagnoses Cartesian mindedness in response to the question, why isn't the Cartesian mind-body problem ancient? and says, takes over the thought people had seen before, that Descartes gives an epistemic characterization of the mind as what's best known to itself. But Rorty says, thinks about it in terms of the normative structure of Cartesian discourse about the mind. Incorrigibility is an authority structure. He says the key thing about Cartesian minds is that there is nothing in principle that can overrule the authority of sincere, contemporaneous, first-person reports of mental occurrences. So now here, and this is a very plausible sort of analysis of Cartesian mindedness, but notice he's thinking about what you have to do to be talking Cartesian mind talk. To do that is to treat sincere first-person contemporaneous reports as having an unoverridable epistemic authority. And he's giving a normative characterization of it. It's the authority structure, the incorrigibility here. And furthermore, as he thinks about the passage from Aristotelian ways of thinking that didn't raise mind-body problems to these Cartesian ones, he's seeing our practices as having changed and brought into existence Cartesian minds when we start treating these reports as incorrigible. And the idea of eliminative materialism was, if we changed our way of talking, if we changed the authority structure of the vocabulary so that the neurophysiologist's cerebroscopes were taken as having an authority that could contest the authority of our reports, we would lose our minds in Descartes' sense, without that keeping us from being able to talk. And what seems to me significant is he's thinking about this ontological category, Cartesian minds, and he's thinking about it in terms of the vocabulary you use to discuss these things, and a normative characterization of the practices you engage in that are the deploying of a vocabulary. And he's seeing that redescribing things using a different vocabulary could eliminate that ontological category. Here he's thinking of vocabularies as being in the ontological driver's seat. And interestingly, we think that about, say, fictions, that it's the way we talk about them that bring Sherlock Holmes into existence. But Rorty was not claiming that the mind is a fiction because it's brought in, the Cartesian mind, because it's brought into existence by adopting a certain vocabulary. He says, no, this is what it is for there really to be Cartesian minds. We really have them, as long as our way of talking has this authority structure. So he's not saying there aren't Cartesian minds or that these are fictional. Here we see, I think, in Nietzsche, we see the seeds of the primacy that he'll give vocabulary over ontology, talk about what we have to do to be talking this way in a normative, pragmatic meta-vocabulary, rather than thinking ontologically or metaphysically about these peculiar things, Cartesian pensées. And we can see the stirrings of his social pragmatism about norms, thinking that what brings this authority structure incorrigibility, the unoverridability of sincere contemporaneous first-person reports into existence is our practices. And that if we change the practices, we wouldn't have that, we wouldn't have those norms, and so wouldn't have the ontology. So I think he's already working in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary to address the discursive practices that articulate Cartesian mindedness, and rejecting a representational semantic meta-vocabulary, saying don't think about the things, think about the way we talk. So Rorty heard me tell this story and said it was absolutely compelling, and it had never occurred to him. He had never thought about his later views as all finding their seeds in this early work. Okay, we did look in detail at Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, the 1979 book. He identifies for the first time now, the Enlightenment notion of representation as the source of philosophical puzzles, which we, looking back, can think of as epitomized by the object naturalists' location or placement problems. That's the sort of puzzle that Rorty thinks you inevitably get if you follow the Enlightenment in thinking of everything in representational terms. And the pragmatist lesson is going to be to stick with describing our ordinary descriptive practices and our natural scientific vocabularies in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. Think about what we're doing when we talk that way, jettisoning the perspective of representational semantic meta-vocabularies. So he traces out the deleterious consequences in the philosophy of mind, in epistemology. In the philosophy of mind, we get givenness. In epistemology, we get oscillation between skepticism and foundationalism that leads us to the privileged representations, the sensuous given and the semantic given that is analyticity. That's when the epistemology has made the linguistic turn, and in Quine. And he can see Quine's critique of analyticity as a pragmatist inquiry into the social practical use of expressions that correspond to the distinctive kind of authority attributed to analytic claims. He's saying, look, what do you have to do to be attributing this distinctive kind of authority to analytic claims? Well, you could hold them true come what may, treat them as unrevisable. That's sort of one of the alternatives that Quine considers. Rorty can now see those moves as pragmatist moves and embrace Quine and Sellers. In Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, pragmatism is only showing up on the edges as a recommendation of a way forward. But in the collection of late 70s essays that comes out in '82, The Consequences of Pragmatism, now he's explicitly saying, let's be pragmatists. And what he's doing there is thinking about vocabularies. He's, for the first time, using that way of talking. The word does appear in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, but it moves to center stage only in the Consequences of Pragmatism book. and wants to consider the relation between the practices of using one vocabulary, the vocabulary of natural science, and the practices of using other vocabularies. He's at least implicitly come to the idea of pragmatism after the linguistic turn as addressing various vocabularies in use, and so working in a pragmatic metavocabulary to describe these practices. And he's introduced the notion of vocabulary downstream from Quine's running together the language theory distinction on the basis that all we really do is talk. We make claims. And what we do, those practices, has to both settle what our words mean and what we take to be true. So Rorty settles on this notion of vocabulary as amphibious, as post-Quinean for doing that. And he redescribes the pathology of representational semantic metavocabularies, a new critique growing out of the one in Mirror, but that we don't see, I think, in just those terms there, saying, if you think that what makes language language is that it represents the way things are, you're committed to this fantasy of the possibility of comparing different vocabularies as better or worse just as vocabularies. Because you think you know what vocabularies are for. They're for representing the way things are. And if you have this representational semantic metavocabulary, if that's your model of meaningfulness, then the idea of being better at representing the world, better at doing what language does, is part and parcel of that model. And this is the slogan of accuracy of representation as something that in a vocabulary independent way can serve as a normative standard for assessing the success of different vocabularies. In effect, if we look back from the Pricean vocabulary, we can see Rorty as denying that the standards of e-representational semantic metavocabularies apply to all vocabularies just as vocabularies. They don't. We can think of all of them. We can all bring them under the umbrella of a pragmatic metavocabulary. Think about what we're doing when we're talking. That's the level at which we can talk about talking just as talking. And the next evolution of, so I mean, at this point, Rorty is a full-blown meta-linguistic pragmatist, I think. The fifth phase, and I mean, of course, there's a lot going on, one could subdivide things, is the phase of contingency, irony, and solidarity, which, remember, Rorty at the end of his life said remained his favorite book, the one he was gladdest to have written and happiest to reread parts of it. And this is where he really exploits the vocabulary. I'll remind you, he never actually calls it that. That's my description of what he's doing. He uses vocabulary without saying that that's the vocabulary he's going to use. But that's only a light explicitation. It's clear that this is what he's doing. And I think what Rorty most esteemed about contingency, irony, and solidarity is that here is where he exploits the romantic idea of the power of redescription, the power that we get because we can switch vocabularies. We can't move out of autonomous discursive practices. We have to speak in some language, But within that overarching language, we have these more local vocabularies, these idioms, and we have a lot of room to move from one to another. We can describe things in terms of, we can talk in the terms of natural science, or we can talk in literary or theological terms. And if you think about the power of vocabulary changing that he'd already seen in the eliminative materialism work, he's now generalizing that. There's a distinctive kind of authority that communities and individual practitioners have to change their worlds by changing their vocabularies. They can bring Cartesian minds into existence or eliminate them. They can understand the world as something merely represented or mirrored, or as an arena for the exercise of their authority. That romantic power of redescription, of changing vocabularies, becomes visible when you adopt the vocabulary as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, as a vocabulary for talking about what you're doing in talking. And Rorty's particularly interested in this romantic power of redescription consequent upon a change of vocabulary when it's self-description that's involved. And it's under that rubric that he brings together political discourse as existentially changing us, deciding who we should be by adopting and endorsing a vocabulary for arguing about who we should be and what we should do. He brings that together with the idea of individual self-transformation by self-redescription, paradigmatically by poets giving us different ways to think about ourselves. I talked about Nehamas's version of Nietzsche, life as literature here. And again, downstream from the eliminative materialism lesson, this is a power of self-transformation ontologically. We become different individuals by adopting different vocabularies, as we become different communities by adopting different vocabularies. So what ties together the private and the public in contingency, irony, and solidarity is, well, the contingency of our vocabularies, the idea that the world is not dictating what vocabulary it's described in, or we describe ourselves in individually or collectively. And so there's a power, that's I described as the romantic power of self-transformation, and the final conception of irony as a certain distance from one's commitment to using a given vocabulary, that is the acknowledgement that it might change, that it's not dictated by the way things are, that it or you be described in these terms. So we remember his saying that the ironist worries that the vocabulary she's using might be a bad one, and might make things invisible to her that should be visible or could be visible, that they're making her not the best person she could be, or making us not the best community that we could be. That's the concern there. So, I mean, thinking about this as a stage in the development of his thought, characterized in the terms that we get from the second half of the course, he's thinking about pragmatism as the adoption of a pragmatic meta-vocabulary rather than a representational semantic meta-vocabulary. He's adopting a specifically normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary. The vocabulary is a normative meta-vocabulary. And he's applying that normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary. He's applying social pragmatism about norms to the norms that are implicit in the vocabulary. We change our social practices. That's how we change the norms that govern our vocabulary. Now, the final evolution of his thought is the Girona conception of pragmatism as anti-representationalism as a form of anti-authoritarianism. This is thinking of pragmatism as a second enlightenment. And what I think is distinctive here, he offers a description in a normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary of the use of representational semantic meta-vocabularies. This is the idea that though people didn't think of it this way, representation was always a normative concept. It always was the idea that what it is to be a representing of some represented is for the represented to have a distinctive kind of authority, and the representing to be responsible to the represented in a distinctive way. The authority of the represented is that it serves as a standard for correctness, for assessments of the correctness or accuracy of what counts as a representing of it, just insofar as it's subject to assessments of that normative kind. And that's the sense in which the representing is responsible for its correctness to what serves as a standard of assessments of its correctness as a representing of that represented. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more one would like to be able to say about just how that normative structure works. But it's enough for his Girona era insight to see that it is a normative structure and to apply social pragmatism about those norms and think, ask the question, what do we have to do in order to be instituting this kind of authority and this kind of responsibility, to be instituting these normative statuses? He's applying social pragmatism about norms in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary to the semantic representational meta-vocabulary, asking what you have to do to be applying the semantic representational meta-vocabulary. And he's saying, well, you have to be seeing these, attributing these normative statuses to things. That's what you have to do, specified in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, in order to be deploying a semantic representational meta-vocabulary. And then he can ask, do we want to do that? Do we want to institute those normative statuses? Is it even intelligible that we do? He's asking. Now, in that last question, I've suggested that he goes a step too far and suggests we can't even make sense of practices that would do this because they're attributing authority to something that can't talk, and we can't make sense of that. I suggest, no, we actually can. But the question remains, do we want to engage in the practices that are instituting this kind of authority and responsibility? And do we want to do that for every one of our vocabularies? Now, Rorty is not making the I representation, E representation distinction. He's thinking of representational vocabularies as E-representational vocabularies and saying, look, it's up to us whether we act in such a way as to institute the authority structure that's made explicit by E-representational semantic vocabularies. And he argues on anti-authoritarian grounds that we shouldn't. And that argument takes place in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. So now, this is a characterization of that last move that we were not in a position to understand when we read the Girona lectures. And it's not a characterization that Rorty himself could have given of it. But once we've redescribed things in terms of two kinds of representational semantic meta-vocabularies, and see that the one he cares about is the E-representational ones. Once we've done that, and downstream from the subject naturalism, object naturalism distinction, we've distinguished pragmatic meta-vocabularies from representational semantic meta-vocabularies, we can see what he's doing. We can see that he's addressing in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary what you need to be doing in order to be deploying an E-representational semantic meta-vocabulary. He's doing that in a normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary, one that is applying concepts like authority and responsibility to understand what you're doing in taking or treating one thing as a representing of another. This is what's going to be articulated in terms of tracking relations, for instance, in Price. He sees what you're doing is deploying, he's using a normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary to describe what you need to do to be using an E-representational semantic meta-vocabulary. And then in his normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary, he's applying the social pragmatist lesson about norms that says normative statuses are social statuses. So, we need to think about our social practices of instituting these representational norms with respect to arbitrary vocabularies that we use. And wants to say, don't do it. Again, with the wisdom that Price gives us, we can say, well, keep them in their place. There will be some vocabularies, the vocabulary of natural science, maybe of ordinary empirical description, where actually it's okay to institute those norms to treat one thing as a representing of another. But it isn't appropriate across the board. Not in every case where you can adopt the subject point of view of a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. So my claim is that the conceptual apparatus that we get from Price, well, when you divide through by the naturalism in the way I've suggested, so as to get to pragmatic and semantic meta-vocabularies, gives us a very clear picture of the move Rorty has made. And it's a brilliant move, right, to characterize E-representational semantic meta-vocabularies in a normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary first, and then to apply social pragmatism about norms to the norms that are instituted, we can see in the normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary, that are instituted by using an E-representational semantic meta-vocabulary. So he's turned the crank on his pragmatism. The pragmatism before this was saying, don't use a representational semantic meta-vocabulary, use a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. that's the analog of Price's saying, don't be an object naturalist, be a subject naturalist. Right? That's just a preference, which, I mean, he can argue for. It's a rational preference, but the pragmatism consists in wanting to replace representational semantic meta-languages with pragmatic meta-vocabularies. So, if we're interested in some, I don't know, cognitive scientists who are interested in the psychological reality of their posits, the early pragmatist is going to say, well, think about what you're doing when you use this theory. Don't fuss metaphysically and ontologically about the status of these postulates that you've got. Think about what you're doing when you talk this way. That was the pragmatist general claim and advice. But now Rorty is doing something much more interesting and complicated than that. He's applying the pragmatic meta-vocabulary to the e-representational semantic meta-vocabulary, not to the target vocabularies, sort of the naturalistic vocabularies, but to the semantic meta-vocabulary. And then applying his social pragmatism about norms to the norms that are implicit in the use of e-representational semantic meta-vocabularies. Now that's a brilliant philosophical move. It's the intellectual pinnacle that Rorty comes to, drawing together all the threads from this rich intellectual life. But we're in a position to appreciate it in a way that he couldn't be. My hero Hegel says our aim is to understand the philosophers we talk about better than they could understand themselves. And I'm saying we're actually in that position with respect to Rorty, the final evolution of his thought. Yeah. So this is, in a certain sense, a big punchline of the course. A reason to have gone through all of the things that we've gone through is just to be able to appreciate this move. We've developed the conceptual machinery to appreciate it. Okay, that was a long rant. Anybody want to say anything about that? Yes, Katja. You need to unmute.
Okay, thank you. We are now applicating the e-representational semantic meta-vocabulary to make sense of Rorty's development towards social institution of norms. But mustn't we understand the e-representational semantic meta-vocabulary as making explicit some kind of authority which is not captured by social norms? For example, I think we make explicit something like causality, causality explicit by e-representational semantic meta-vocabulary, and this is not. Can we really? Doesn't Price take a step back from social institution?
Okay. Yes, very good. I mean, I have been in here pitching sort of Rorty's line as re-described, but it certainly raises a question whether this is a case where social pragmatism about norms is appropriate, or whether there isn't something more robust in some more robust form of normativity involved in the representation. It obviously depends on how we understand the working of e-representational semantic meta-vocabularies. And Price, in invoking tracking relations in his theory in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary of the use of e-representational semantic metavocabularies is going to find something more robust, something that reflects relations in nature, not just, I mean, that's what the naturalism, but with the fact that the pragmatic metavocabulary that he's going to use to understand e-representational semantic metavocabularies being a naturalistic vocabulary, that is a rejection of social pragmatism about those norms. He's going to be disagreeing with Rorty in that regard. And that's actually where I want to turn next, is to the positive tasks that get left over for those of us downstream from Rorty's meta-linguistic pragmatism, the tasks that are left over of characterizing in pragmatic metavocabularies the use of different kinds of vocabularies, not the least among them being the e-representational semantic metavocabularies. So that's exactly what I want to discuss next. But you're right, we should not just uncritically say, oh, and Rorty was right to make this move. I mean, it's a brilliant move. I don't, but that's not to say we have to go along, that we have to go along there, go along with it. And you're right too, the price does not. Yeah, so the lesson of the previous section was just to think about the difference between pragmatism, the pragmatism that consists in recommending we work in pragmatic metavocabularies as opposed to representational semantic metavocabularies. That's sort of background Rorty pragmatism. To the move, the final turn of the crank, where he applies a pragmatic metavocabulary to representational, indeed e-representational semantic metavocabularies. And this, I really think, is the way forward for the kind of meta-linguistic pragmatism that Rorty pioneered. Remember, in one of the late things that we read of Price, he objects when he's pentangulating the method of differences, putting his global expressivism, setting it in philosophical space. One of the points he pentangulates on is the theoretical quietists, inspired by the later Wittgenstein. His paradigm of the quietist is John McDowell, who are right, as far as Price is concerned, on the negative side, in properly rejecting the assumption that e-representational semantic meta-languages are universally applicable or appropriate. But they stop there. And his objection to them is that they shirk the positive task of providing accounts of potentially problematic vocabularies in pragmatic metavocabularies. That is, they shirk the task of doing just what Rorty did in the anti-authoritarian things, namely describe in his favored normative pragmatic metavocabulary what you have to do to be using an e-representational semantic metavocabulary. Now, parenthetically, it's at least not obvious that the later Wittgenstein is a quietist in this regard. You can read him as doing exactly that, describing in his favorite pragmatic metavocabulary what you have to do to be using various potentially problematic vocabularies. It's just that his preferred pragmatic metavocabulary is what I'll call a natural language naturalistic metavocabulary. I'll get to that. Price and I agree that the constructive theoretical philosophical task that Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatism bequeaths to those of us who come after Rorty is to use pragmatic metavocabularies to characterize the use of interesting or potentially philosophically problematic target vocabularies. And among these are Well, discursive practices generally, what I called autonomous discursive practices. Here, maybe I can usefully. Yeah, so one thing we might want to do is describe in pragmatic meta-vocabularies what it is to talk, to use a discursive vocabulary, to use an autonomous discursive vocabulary. Also, we could be interested in characterizing I-representational semantic meta-vocabularies. That is, the semantic meta-vocabularies that we use to make explicit the representational dimension that all declarative sentences have. That the sentences, all the sentences can be used to make assertions, and in this light sense, non-committal sense, are fact stating. We'd like to know, well, what do you have to do to be using those I-representational semantic meta-vocabularies? And again, we want to use pragmatic meta-vocabularies to characterize E-representational semantic meta-vocabularies. And I want to consider some candidates for that. A further task is to use pragmatic meta-vocabularies to characterize naturalistic meta-vocabularies. Sorry, naturalistic vocabularies and meta-vocabularies. And here I want to register the question, isn't there at least an intimate relation between characterizing E-representational semantic meta-vocabularies and characterizing naturalistic vocabularies? And in fact, the bold claim I want to make is naturalistic vocabularies are just the ones that are appropriately treated by E-representational semantic meta-vocabularies. Now that's a bold claim, but that's what I'm going to want to say. But again, as a target vocabulary, we might care about normative vocabularies and want to know, what do you have to do, specified in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, to thereby be deploying a normative vocabulary. And this isn't something Rorty cares about. It isn't something Price cares about, but I've suggested another category of interesting vocabularies is categorial vocabularies, vocabularies whose expressive job it is to make explicit features of the pragmatic and semantic framework within which one can talk at all, and suggested that logical vocabulary, alethic modal vocabulary, and normative vocabulary are vocabularies of that categorial kind. So here's a budget of philosophical tasks for post-Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatists. Is, in your favored pragmatic meta-vocabulary, give an account of these 6 kinds of vocabulary, as well as, if you care about mathematical vocabulary, the vocabulary of, say, neuroscience or metaphysics or whatever your favorite vocabulary is. This is the constructive task that Rorty's meta-linguistic pragmatism bequeaths to us. So under that rubric, let me remind you of some of the things that I've sketched or waved my hands at responding to these constructive tasks. Now, as far as autonomous discursive practices are concerned, a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for them, well, that, looking back, is what I was trying to do in making it explicit, was describe in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary what you have to do such that by doing that, you count as talking, you count as making claims, saying that things are thus and so, making assertions, using declarative sentences, and so conferring propositional content on the performances and expressions that you have. That's the iron triangle of discursiveness. Price, by and large, just buys all that. He's happy to take over my account as at least a responsive answer to this challenge. If not, something like the only straw floating. I mean, I think there's 63 ways of doing this, but here is one. And just to go one level slightly deeper, the way that account works in my favorite normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary, the criterion of demarcation for being a discursive practice is that some performances have the pragmatic significance of being claimings or assertings. That's downtown in language games. That's criterial for being a language game. And that's the pragmatic criterion that you should appeal to in marking out declarative sentences syntactically and propositional contents semantically. And the home language game of assertions, the practices, the structure of practices in which something can have the pragmatic significance of an assertion is a practice of giving, asking for, and challenging reasons. Assertions are what can both serve as, and stand in need of reasons. Assertable, that is propositional contents, are what can play both the role of premise and conclusion of inferences. And that's why assertion and inference are coordinate concepts. You can only make sense of one of them in the context of the other. And wheeling now in the normative character of this pragmatic meta-vocabulary, the pragmatic significance of asserting is to undertake or acknowledge a commitment. And providing reasons for and against claims affects interlocutors' entitlements to those commitments. So commitment and entitlement, that's a two-sorted normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary that I'm using. And fourth element of this, that assertional practices of giving and asking for reasons, are social practices in which the pragmatic significance of performances is to alter the deontic normative score that interlocutors keep on each other. That is what they take each other to be committed and entitled to, and the inferential relations among these propositional contents are what determine how you update the score of commitments and entitlements given the speech act somebody's performed. So my point now is not to sort of lay out this theory or argue for it, just to mark that as an instance of a responsive answer to the challenge. Okay, post-Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatist, give me an account in your favored pragmatic meta-vocabulary of what a vocabulary is in the sense of an autonomous discursive practice, a language game that can be played though one played no other. So there's a responsive answer. One, as I say, there's lots of other answers you could give that would be responsive, but there's one. Now, the claim is that any vocabulary, anything that is the deploying of declarative sentences, so involves the making of assertions, will have a representational dimension, an I-representational dimension. That is, we'll be able to use a representational semantic meta-vocabulary to talk about it. That's what, from Price's point of view, Rorty should not have denied. He should have allowed this much. And it's not that Rorty didn't make any gestures in this way. You know, he talks about merely cautionary uses of true, or talks about using truth just as an empty honorific, or just as a way of characterizing the planks on Neurath's boat that we're not currently replacing. And all of those, I think, we can see as gestures towards the appropriateness of an I-representational semantic meta-vocabulary. Just saying, well, that isn't going to get us into the kind of trouble that he was diagnosing in PMN. And here, I want to say, give three examples, remind you of three examples that we've run by. One is deflationary or broadly disquotational accounts of the use of the word true, and also refers and denotes in this sense, and a correspondingly light deflated sense of fact stating. This is what Price talks about under the heading of semantic minimalism. And the challenge is to give an account of the use of these semantic locutions that apply to any declaratives. They're truth apt, we say. You can ask, is that true? Is it not? If it is true, then it's fact stating in this light sense. But there's a substantial job of work to be done in characterizing, in your favorite pragmatic meta vocabulary, truth talk. What this deflationary use of truth is, and that's what the my favorite deflationary account of truth, the anaphoric proform forming operator account of true and refers that you see in chapter 5 of Making It Explicit. Doesn't have to be that one. Paul Horich has got another wonderful one. Price is happy with both of them. Second, that we were talking about just recently, both Price and I see a notion of truth or truth conditions that applies to all declaratives. It's an I-representational notion, but it goes beyond the merely deflated notion. It goes beyond justification or assertability, what your community will let you get away with, or the parts of Neurath's vote that we're currently leaving alone, to use Rorty's phrases. And it goes beyond the merely cautionary uses, where Rorty says, look, I believe this, but I know it might not be true. That's announcing your fallibilism, there could be good reason to change my mind later on. Both Price and I see a more robust notion of truth that's still I-representational, still applies to all declaratives. Price, in Truth as Convenient Friction, looks downstream to the significance of assertions as premises providing reasons against other assertions. And in Truth and Assertability, I also look downstream to the significance of assertions as premises providing reasons for other claims. And both of us, I think, are articulating this key observation that claimables that have the same circumstances of appropriate application, same assertability conditions you're entitled to under the same conditions, can have different consequences of application, can play different roles as premises. And if we take both of these into account, we get a notion of content as inferential role, the connection between circumstances and consequences of application, that lets us, at least gives us a head start, it gives us a first step in explaining the embedded use of declarative sentences when they're not force-bearing, but are just, their content is making a contribution to the pragmatic significance of compounds and complexes involving them. That's what we need to respond to the Frege-Geach objection to first wave meta-ethical expressivism, Ayer and Stevenson, accepting this demand that you have to be able to account for the embedded uses. It's this more robust notion of truth that goes with the consequences of application, the role of something as a premise, not just as a conclusion of inference. And this gives us our first purchase on the possibility of doing formal semantics, again, at the purely declarative level. So I don't want to rehearse that story again. I just want to characterize it here. What it's doing is articulating in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary this representational dimension, I-representational dimension of the use of any declaratives, a more robust notion of truth than the notion of justification or assertability or entitlement will give you. And the third one that we've seen, the third I-representational semantic idiom that we've seen an account of in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary is the idea that I-representational vocabularies can express differences of social practice, of social perspective between attributing commitments to others and undertaking them oneself. So we saw this in two different ways. One was an account of using the term knowledge, modeled on the traditional JTB account, justified true belief, which aims to give truth conditions for knowledge. Working instead in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, we say what you're doing when you attribute knowledge to somebody. And we say, well, you're attributing a commitment. That's what corresponds to the belief condition. You're attributing entitlement to that commitment. That's what corresponds to the justification condition. And you're undertaking commitment yourself. That's what you're endorsing the claim, undertaking the commitment yourself. That's what corresponds to the truth condition. Now, the difference between justification and truth, there's a difference between attributing and undertaking. That's a difference of social perspective. And the second way in which this, so the point of that is, that's a way of specifying in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, one that says what you're doing when you talk knowledge talk, this I-representational idiom, explaining the use of the factive attribution of knowledge, which is I-representational locution. The other case that we looked at, well, I waved my hands and it's complicated at this, and it was complicated enough that you're certainly forgiven if you didn't get much of it, was the claim that the locutions in ordinary natural language that express the I-representational dimension, not the ones the philosophers care so much about, the explicitly semantic truth talk that we give the deflationary account of, or the notion of knowledge, which doesn't loom that large in most people's lives, but the locution we use to distinguish between what you're saying and what you're talking about, what you're thinking and what you're thinking of, that of and about when they express intentional directedness, the claim is what makes those words mean what they mean is their use in de re ascriptions of propositional attitude, saying things like Henry Adams believed of Benjamin Franklin that he invented the lightning rod. And I gave an account of those de re locutions also in terms of their distinctive expressive role being keeping track of the difference between the commitment you're attributing when you're attributing a propositional attitude to someone and the commitments that you undertake in it. Roughly, you undertake an identificatory commitment, what you're saying the person is thinking or is talking about, and you attribute the doxastic commitment. Okay, the details of that don't matter. You can look back on that. The important point here is that's an instance of saying in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary what you have to do, how you have to be using propositional attitude descriptions in this case, in order thereby to be applying an I-representational semantic meta-vocabulary, a vocabulary of talking and thinking about what you're talking and thinking about. So we've got these three instances of doing that: the deflationary accounts of truth talk, the accounts of how to get propositional contents as inferential roles that are more robust than just assertability conditions. Price, truth is convenient friction, truth and assertability. And these two instances, JTB and de re ascriptions, all of these are accounts in pragmatic metavocabularies of the use of I-representational semantic metavocabularies. So these are instances of what you should be doing downstream from Rorty's meta-linguistic pragmatism as applied to I-representational idioms. So I've at least waved my hands at what you might try and do to answer that call for autonomous discursive practices generally, and for I-representational semantic metavocabularies in particular. And what I want to do next is go through the same sort of story about E-representational semantic metavocabularies, the ones that don't apply to declaratives generally, to autonomous discursive practices generally, but that only apply to some things. But let me pause here in this breathless rehearsal for comments or questions about this so far. Okay. So the next potential task is to use pragmatic meta vocabularies. Well, really, we can see they're meta vocabularies to characterize e-representational semantic meta vocabularies, which, having taken the negative thesis of Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatism on board, we now don't think of as applicable to vocabularies in general. They're only going to be applicable to some. So, but as long as they're kept in their place, they're okay. How are we going to keep them in their place? Well, if we had a good account in a pragmatic meta vocabulary of what you're doing when you use one, then we have at least the raw materials to ask, well, when should you do that? And when shouldn't you? And I've suggested 5 different candidate conceptions of semantic e-representation. Just isomorphism of constellations of representings and representeds. That's maybe the Spinozistic notion. Suggest that's not a very interesting one, maybe a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. Isomorphisms come too cheap because you can always find some vocabulary. Given any two things, you can find some vocabulary in which they're isomorphic. Got the quantifier over the vocabularies wide open. Second, subjunctively robust tracking of representeds by representings. Isomorphism, you describe it in extensional language, it's just a relation. Tracking is subjunctively robust. It induces isomorphisms, but it's also true that if the one were different, the other would be different. This is what Fodor talks about as one-way counterfactual dependences of horses on horses, of representings on representeds. And this is where Price tentatively plants his flag. He says, okay, this there is something to this. He invokes Sellers' picturing, says this is what Sellers was on about picturing. And for some vocabularies, it makes sense to see them as tracking objects which they then, in that sense, count as of or about. And there's a kind of normativity that goes with that if there's some change in the represented that we want to say should, according to the tracking relation, make a difference in the representing, and it doesn't, we can say, okay, something's gone wrong. There's a normative notion there. So there's many ways to lay this out. The important thing for me is it's a notion you're going to express in an Analytic modal vocabulary. That is, a tracking e-representational semantic meta-vocabulary will be a richly Analytic modal vocabulary. So one of the things we'd like to have a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for is Analytic modal vocabulary. That's what we're going to need to get these tracking relations, however we do the details of it. I suggested a third one, a third e-representational idiom for a third e-representational idiom that looks not, as it were, to the semantics, but to the epistemology. That's an empirical structure of justification that if observation reports, non-inferentially elicited reports, have a suitable kind of authority epistemologically, if there's something like the ultimate court of justificatory appeal for being entitled to claims, then it's an empirical practice. Not all of them are. Theological language, not really an empirical language. It doesn't have the right authority structure. Non-inferential reports don't play the right role in it. But those reports connect you, in some sense causally, to the things you're reporting. That's another e-representational idiom. And it's a non-trivial job of work to pick a good pragmatic meta-vocabulary and specify what that empirical structure of justification is, just to say what non-inferential reports are. Parenthetically, my version of that, building on Sellers, says, well, there's two elements. You have to have reliable differential responsive dispositions to be producing the observation reports, and you have to be applying concepts which are taking up normative stances that are inferentially related to other things. So I call this the two-ply account of non-inferential reports. There are all kinds of other ways of doing it. The important thing is all of them are trying to specify in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary what you're doing, what you have to do in order to be applying an empirical semantic meta-vocabulary, which I'm saying is a kind of e-representational semantic meta-vocabulary. And the fourth one, which I have at various points articulated, says really you should combine the first two. You should have the representings epistemically tracking the representeds and an empirical structure of justification. And if you've got both of those and they have to interact in the right way, then you've got a particularly robust kind of e-representational relation, which will apply to natural scientific discourse and to ordinary empirical descriptive discourse. Related to these really three live possibilities, tracking, empirical, and the combination of those, because I put the isomorphism to one side, it comes for free with tracking. Related in complicated ways that I don't understand very well at all is what Price calls the Eleatic criterion, where we say for some criterion of adequacy of your semantic meta-vocabulary, you have to use and not just mention the terms of the vocabulary that it's a semantic meta-vocabulary for. So in order to properly explain the content of electron claims, you have to talk about electrons and standing in various, the users of the term standing in various relations to electrons. So in the semantic vocabulary, you're using the expressions as well as mentioning them. That's the Eleatic criterion. And for certain criteria of adequacy for semantic meta-vocabularies and for certain subject matters, that Eleatic criterion is going to be met. And that's another e-representational vocabulary. So we can ask, when I talk about moral values, in the semantic vocabulary, meta-vocabulary I use, am I going to just talk about moral attitudes, that is uses of expressions like morally wrong, or am I also going to have to use the expression and say, well, you have to use this so that you're responding by using the expression morally wrong to things that are morally wrong. That's the Eleatic sort of realism. As I say, this is related only in complicated but very interesting ways to the other criteria of e-representation here. But what we want, this is the point, is for all of these to understand each of them individually and their relation to other ones in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. That's the task that we post-Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatists have as a constructive, theoretical, philosophical task. Now, I raised the question as we sort of step on to ask about naturalistic vocabularies and pragmatic meta-vocabularies for naturalistic vocabularies. I say, well, how do you have to use expressions such that by using them that way, they will count as naturalistic? Well, we could just do it extensionally and say, well, that's the vocabulary that's used in the natural sciences, or maybe only in fundamental physics, or to go the other way, maybe we count ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. But we could just say, well, by naturalistic vocabulary, when I say I'm a naturalist, whether it's an object naturalist or a subject naturalist, I mean that I'm going to use a meta vocabulary that is one of these kinds. That's what I mean by naturalistic. I think there's a connection between being a naturalistic vocabulary and admitting of, or maybe requiring, an e-representational semantic meta-vocabulary, a treatment in an e-representational semantic meta-vocabulary. At any rate, I'm interested in senses of naturalistic vocabulary that can be defined by the applicability of e-representational semantic meta-vocabularies to the vocabulary that counts as naturalistic just in virtue of admitting of this kind of e-representational semantic treatment. That would be one way of picking out naturalistic vocabularies in terms of a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, if you have a specification in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary of these e-representational semantic meta-vocabularies. Okay, let me stop there. We've talked about pragmatic meta-vocabularies for discursive practices generally, for various I-representational semantic meta-vocabularies, and for various senses of e-representational semantic meta-vocabularies. And one try at specifying in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary naturalistic vocabularies by going through the notion of e-representational semantic meta-vocabularies. Think back to the first class we had and how berserk you would have thought the things I'm saying are, how unintelligible they would have been at that point. I mean, I'm sort of verging on it here, but we've assembled a conceptual apparatus here that can do a lot of work. I think people think of pragmatism as merely critical meta-philosophy. No, there's a real philosophical job of work for pragmatists. Okay. Another task is giving a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, a specification in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary of normative vocabularies. And I said something about that last time or the time before, about thinking of the role that expressions play in codifications of patterns of practical reasoning. That my suggestion was that the expressive role characteristic of normative vocabulary is to express your endorsement of a pattern of practical reasoning. And obviously you need to tell the whole story about that, but that's a way to go. And then finally, as I say, this is not something Price cares about. All the earlier ones are things Price cares about, but I care about using pragmatic meta-vocabularies to characterize categorical meta-vocabularies. Intuitively, Kantian notion, vocabularies that make explicit features of the framework of any autonomous discursive practice. And the way I want to pick them out is as universally LX for every ADP. So they're elaborated from any vocabulary. That is, in using any autonomous discursive engaging in any autonomous discursive practice, you already know how to do everything you need to know how to do to apply these concepts. You just need to hook those abilities up to a word. Sellers' grasp of a concept is always mastery of the use of a word. Paradigm is introducing conditionals to codify inferential relations. So these are categorical in that they're elaborated from the abilities that you have in engaging in an autonomous discursive practice. That's what is behind on this meta-linguistic reading. Kant's talk about the categories being available a priori. You already know how to do everything you need to know how to do to apply these, if you can apply any concepts. That's the L part, elaborated from, of the LX, and they're explicative of those autonomous discursive practices. They're making explicit features that any autonomous practice has. And here paradigms are logical vocabulary that makes explicit relations of implication and incompatibility, alethic modal vocabulary that makes explicit this ranges of subjunctive robustness of the inferential relations of concepts, and normative vocabulary that makes explicit features of what you're doing in applying any concepts in an ADP. So again, for our purposes here, what matters is that's an attempt to pick out a class of concepts, to pick out a kind of vocabulary, categorical vocabulary, in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, to say what you need to be able to do in order to use expressions in a categorical meta-vocabulary. You have to use them in a way that is universally LX. That's the claim. I say you could go on and be a post-Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatist, give that treatment to other vocabularies, mathematical vocabulary, metaphysical vocabulary, whatever your target vocabulary you find potentially interesting or puzzling. This is the pragmatist approach. Now, I want to apply this general apparatus to the naturalistic and normative pragmatic meta-vocabularies. Because remember, among the constructive post-Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatists that we looked at, Price and me, Price favors naturalistic pragmatic meta-vocabularies, and I favor normative pragmatic meta-vocabularies. Rorty himself uses both. He uses naturalistic ones when he's channeling Dewey and talking about coping. He's thinking of that in a vaguely evolutionary way, or anyway, in the sort of selectional way that's common to evolution and learning. But he uses normative ones in the cases that I talk about, in the places where I want to talk about him using the vocabulary. When he's talking about choices among vocabularies and so on, he's using a richly normative vocabulary to describe the different kinds of transformation that redescription can make, and so on. So the main thing I want to say is that there's more gray area or no man's land between the normative and the naturalistic pragmatic meta-vocabularies than you might first think. There's an overlap in ways of conceiving these. And one of them is, if you understand normative statuses as socially instituted by normative attitudes, that is, if you're a social pragmatist about norms, that account is broadly naturalistic. I mean, you're not going to find norms instituted that way in the furniture of the world as described in natural science. But you will in social science. This is the sort of thing that it's the sort of ontological category that prices fall under in economics. They're products of our exchange behavior, treating things as commodities that we bring into existence by commodity exchange. We bring into existence prices. And the claim is that's a model for norms generally. And though that's not naturalistic in a narrow sense, it is in a broad sense. And this might be a particular instance of what McDowell calls relaxed naturalism, which is non-scientistic naturalism about norms. A second way, so that's sort of understanding norms, normative statuses as social statuses, is a broadly naturalistic. Naturalism of second nature, McDowell says, as socially instituted. He doesn't like that paraphrase of second nature, but it's in the vicinity. A second sort of form of overlap, and what seems to me to be the principal contemporary philosophical rival of social practice accounts of norms, is teleosemantics. Millikan, Papineau, Starelny are principal players in this field. If you emphasize the semantic in teleosemantic, I think Ruth Millikan is by far the most sophisticated of them. But what they're offering is, in effect, a natural scientific account of the institution of ultimately discursive norms. And doing that in a way, this is self-consciously, in Millikan's case, following out Peircean pragmatism, as using the selectional mechanisms that on the one hand are common to evolution and individual learning, and on the other hand are articulable using an Analytic modal semantic metavocabulary. So here, Ganzkurz is the idea. This is the way Elliot Sober puts it. How you can get intentions with an S rather than just extensions out of selectional mechanisms. Suppose we've got a bunch of large black marbles and a bunch of small white marbles, and we put them through a sieve. And so it selects all and only the white small marbles. It's selecting white, color, and small size. But we can say it's selecting for size and not color, because if there were a small black marble, it would select that. So we can see that even though these categories are coextensive, the size and the color, we can still see this selectional mechanism as discriminating between these coextensive properties if we think about what it would do if such and such. So the teleosemantic program aims to, this is not the way any of them are going to like putting it, but to give an Analytic modal semantic metavocabulary for a normative vocabulary. For a normative vocabulary describing the norms of using expressions. That's what they're trying to do. And though this is not the way I go, as I say, this is true to Peircean pragmatist tradition. And I think this is an exciting program, and I want to see, I wish it all success and want to see it go on. But that's a way of saying, look, I don't have to pick between a naturalistic account and a normative account. And if you asked Price, he would almost certainly endorse the teleosemantic account of normativity and say, okay, that's how he's going to get the effect that I get using a normative pragmatic metavocabulary. Third suggestion, what I want to call natural language naturalism, that says, look, you can specify the use of vocabularies. You can use as your pragmatic metavocabulary any vocabulary exclusive of the target vocabulary that you're giving a pragmatic metavocabulary for. You can't, on pain of circularity, use that, okay, but anything else is okay. Now, I think that's what the later Wittgenstein does, that he's a natural language naturalist. He is a subject naturalist in Price's terms. He's using a pragmatic metavocabulary to tell us what you have to do to be talking this way. Don't worry about what numbers are, worry about how you can learn to use numerals, to count, to add, and so on. What are the rules for the language you use to describe that? Well, anything you think your audience will understand that doesn't use the questionable vocabulary that's there. And then if people have a problem with some bit of vocabulary you're using, then they can raise it. But there aren't any rules in advance. Just use natural language as your naturalistic pragmatic metavocabulary. And now, I think it's interesting that natural language naturalism in this sense comes with ordinary language and ideal language versions. Wittgenstein is going to be using the ordinary language version. No restrictions on the natural language that you use to do this. what corresponds to the ideal language in this case, naturalism in this case, is regimenting the natural language. That is stipulating that you're going to use these words holding fixed certain relations of implication or incompatibility between them, that regiments, that's Quine's term, regiments the use of them so that they're technical terms, in effect. It's parasitic on their ordinary use, but you clean it up. That's the regimented use. That's what I do when I'm theorizing. When I'm talking about de dicto and de re, ascriptions of propositional attitude, I'll say, well, let's regiment these so that we only use of in marking off the de re region, and we use that to mark off the de dicto region. In natural language, we're sloppy about this, but think about that. Or I'll say, look, I'm just going to use the terms commitment and entitlement with the following principles about them. I'm piggybacking on the use in natural language, but regimenting. Now that's what Wittgenstein doesn't want to do. He doesn't want to regiment the natural language that he uses as his pragmatic metavocabulary. That's what, following, I think, Sellers, as a systematic philosophical theorizer, I'm perfectly comfortable with and feel that you get a bonus in clarity. The analytic credo is hope, faith, and clarity, and the greatest of these is clarity. I think you get that for regimenting the idiom that you're using as a pragmatic metavocabulary. This is much less radical than ideal language philosophy, which started from just artificially stipulated calculi. This is natural language naturalism, because you're starting from the use, the live use of these expressions, but you're idealizing it a bit. You're regimenting it a bit. I would see these two species of natural language naturalism. And these are also going to be in the overlap. Well, that's a sense of naturalistic that lets you use normative vocabulary. I mean, sort of in either one of them, you can. All right, final move I want to make, and this is not something that I have said before. The reason in the end that I care about those categorial vocabularies, the ones that are universally LX, is that I think they can do the work of both semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies. And here's the sketch of the argument that would have to be colored in. First of all, use these categorial metavocabularies to specify the use of e-representational semantic metavocabularies in all the senses I talked about before. You use the modal categorical vocabulary to make sense of tracking. You use the normative one to make sense of the empirical authority structure. You use them to make sense of the Eleatic criterion. All of that's categorical. Use that, argue that, and this was the claim I made before, that to be a naturalistic vocabulary just is to be a vocabulary that's appropriately treated by an e-representational semantic metavocabulary. Well, if then we can distinguish the use of e-representational semantic metavocabularies in a categorical pragmatic metavocabulary, then we can pick out naturalistic vocabularies. We can specify the use of naturalistic vocabularies in a categorical pragmatic metavocabulary. So both naturalistic and normative pragmatic meta-vocabularies are such that their use can be specified in a categorical pragmatic meta-vocabulary. And that's what I mean by saying we can do the work of those with the categorical concepts. And now here's the final turn. And I don't know whether an argument like this can really be made, but here's my thought of an argument that you can't argue that categorical vocabularies are illegitimate in any sense of illegitimate. Remember the worry about invidiously distinguishing, is this a puzzling vocabulary that we need to explain the use of rather than just use? Why can't, I say, you tell me, you pick the sense of legitimate that you want, as strenuous as you want, I don't care what it is. You can't argue that categorical vocabulary is illegitimate in your sense without accepting that autonomous discursive practices are illegitimate in that sense. Because all I need to tell you how to use these things, and so what they mean, is an autonomous discursive practice. If it's legitimate in your sense, then because you can elaborate the use of these expressions entirely on the basis of that, they can't be illegitimate if the autonomous discursive practices from which they're elaborated are legitimate. So these are sort of hyper-legitimate vocabularies. That's what I want to claim. And I think that actually tracks something that Kant thought about categorical concepts as well. You can't claim either that they're unintelligible or even that you don't understand them because of this framework explicating role. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about in the way of adjudicating the debate between Priceans who want a naturalistic pragmatic meta-vocabulary and Brandomians who want a normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary. Say, really, we don't have to make this choice. What I really want is categorical pragmatic meta-vocabularies. That's going to do the work of naturalistic and normative, and it's going to let us do both the pragmatic meta-vocabulary work and the semantic meta-vocabulary work. So, our universal philosophical vocabulary is the categorical meta-vocabularies. That's what I would like to be able to argue for. I mean, all I'm doing is sketching out how an argument might go if I could fill in all the pieces of it. But what I said I wanted to do in this concluding session was sort of pull all the threads together from what we saw, what we learned from Rorty, and what we learned from Price, and the other things that we read. And I hope I've done that in the sort of two pieces of showing how Rorty's development looks when we apply all the conceptual apparatus that we've developed during the course and use that as the vocabulary to describe what he's doing in, and using that same conceptual apparatus, that same vocabulary of pragmatic and semantic meta-vocabularies, of I-representational, E-representational vocabularies, and so on, to characterize the whole field of theoretical philosophical tasks that is opened up for post-Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatists. Now, I don't say that everything that's worth doing philosophically is one of these tasks. Far from it. But all these things are interesting and worthwhile doing. There's plenty of parameters in there what kind of vocabulary are you going to use as a pragmatic meta vocabulary? What kind of target vocabularies are you going to look at? This is not just sort of a philosophical view. It's setting out a philosophical agenda, a field of study for sort of open-ended theorizing. And I've found over the course of sort of the development this semester, I've been absolutely astonished at how much sense this meta vocabulary makes of sort of all the work I've been doing my entire life, which I didn't think of all these tasks as sort of fitting together as being just the sort of thing that a post-Rortyian meta-linguistic pragmatist ought to be doing. In some sense, I mean, I was responding to my teacher, but I at least feel that I understand him a lot better than I did before, and am astonished to see sort of how much of my own work is just doing exactly what you ought to do if you understood what he was doing better than he did and better than I did. So I hope you've gotten a lot of that and find that it was made the slog through these 14 weeks worthwhile. So that's the story. I will, as always, stick around if people want to talk about it. But as I say, I hope it's been enlightening, this redescription. Thank you.